In the Victorian age, beauty was not simply admired, it was measured. Measured in the paleness of skin untouched by sun, in the faint bloom of cheeks that suggested youth without vulgarity, in eyes bright enough to reflect candlelight, but never too sharp, never too knowing. Under gas lamps and crystal chandeliers, faces glowed, a glow that spoke of refinement, of social standing, of lives protected from labor, hunger, and dirt. But that glow was not always natural. In parlors and dressing rooms across Britain and Europe, small rituals took place each morning. A pill dissolved beneath the tongue, a wafer swallowed with tea, a powder brushed gently across the skin, a tonic measured carefully by trembling hands. Not rouge, not chalk, not pearl dust. Arsenic. Arsenic had a name long before it had a reputation. It was known to alchemists, to apothecaries, to assassins. It was tasteless, colorless, odorless, a substance so subtle it could pass unnoticed, slipping through the body quietly, leaving only its effects behind. For centuries, arsenic had been feared, and then in the 19th century, it was invited in. Doctors prescribed it, pharmacists sold it, newspapers advertised it. In careful doses, arsenic promised transformation, a clearer complexion, a fuller figure, a soft, luminous whiteness prized above all else. It sharpened the eyes, it brought color to the cheeks, it created the illusion of vitality as it slowly hollowed the body from within. This was not a fringe practice. It was not desperation alone. Respectable women used arsenic, doctors recommended it, well-dressed men swallowed it before social engagements, and most unsettling of all, they knew it was poison. They simply believed they could control it. In Victorian society, danger was often reframed as discipline. Corsets crushed ribs and organs in the name of elegance. Tight shoes deformed feet for the sake of fashion. Lead and mercury were already familiar companions. Arsenic felt manageable, a calculated risk. After all, beauty had always required sacrifice. But arsenic did something no other cosmetic could. It worked from the inside out. It didn't just coat the skin, it altered the body's chemistry. And for a while, it worked beautifully. Women whispered about it in drawing rooms, about the glow, about the way it made you feel noticed, about how men lingered just a moment longer, how mirrors seemed kinder, how the body felt stronger, until it didn't. Because arsenic was not a sudden killer, it was patient. It settled into the liver, into the skin, into the nerves. It stole strength quietly, it reshaped bodies subtly, it masked its damage behind beauty. And when the body began to fail, few recognized the cause. This is not a story of ignorance, it is a story of pressure, of a society that demanded perfection and offered poison as the price of entry, a story where medicine blurred into fashion, where advertising drowned out caution, where danger was wrapped in lace and sold as self-improvement. Tonight, we will open the drawers of Victorian dressing tables. We will step into gas-lit bedrooms and crowded pharmacies. We will listen to the promises and the consequences. Because this was not just a beauty trend, it was a slow, elegant experiment performed on an entire generation. This is the arsenic diet of the Victorians, and you are listening to the Story Vault Buried Truths. Chapter 1: Beauty as Survival. To modern ears, Victorian beauty rituals often sound excessive. Corsets that reshaped ribs, cosmetics mixed from chalk, lead, and mercury, hairpieces made from the hair of the dead. But for Victorian women, and many men, beauty was not indulgence, it was insurance. In a society with limited rights, limited income, and rigid class boundaries, appearance was one of the few tools available to negotiate safety. For women especially, survival often depended on one thing: marriage. Marriage was not romance, it was livelihood. A good match meant stability, a bad match meant dependency, no match meant poverty, and beauty, defined narrowly, brutally, was the gateway. A woman's face was read like a resume. Pale skin suggested leisure, even coloration suggested health, a faint flush implied youth and fertility, but too much color suggested vulgarity, labor, or illness. Complexion was moralized. A clear face implied self-control, blemishes suggested internal disorder. Darkened skin hinted at outdoor work, and therefore lower class. Looking healthy mattered more than being healthy. This is the distinction that shaped everything. Victorian society believed the body reflected the soul. Illness was often interpreted as weakness of character. Frailty implied emotional instability. A woman who looked unwell was thought unreliable, unfit for marriage, motherhood, or polite society. So women learned to mask, to correct, to discipline their bodies into acceptability. Even young girls absorbed these lessons early. Etiquette manuals instructed them on posture, complexion, and expression. Don't laugh too loudly, don't flush too deeply, don't allow the sun to touch your skin. Mothers monitored daughters closely. A girl's future could hinge on how she looked during a single season. And then there was competition. Ballrooms, church pews, afternoon teas. Dozens of young women measured silently against one another. Who glowed the most? Who looked freshest? Who appeared effortlessly refined? Arsenic did not enter a vacuum. It entered a battlefield. Men were not immune to these pressures. While women bore the brunt, men were also judged by appearance. Paleness suggested wealth. A refined glow suggested access to comfort and leisure. A sickly man risked being seen as weak, unsuitable for leadership or advancement. Beauty signaled power. Class lines were brutally visible on the body. The working class bore sun-darkened skin, rough hands, worn features. The upper classes worked indoors, moved slowly, preserved their appearance. Whiteness, literal whiteness, became shorthand for respectability. Any product that promised to erase those lines was immediately valuable. This is where danger becomes normalized. When beauty determines survival, risk feels reasonable. Pain becomes proof of effort. Discomfort becomes discipline. Harm becomes invisible if it delivers results. Arsenic did not present itself as poison. It presented itself as control. Unlike rouge, which could smear, or powder, which could cake, arsenic worked invisibly. It altered circulation. It affected pigmentation. It created the illusion of vitality from within. A woman could appear naturally radiant, as though she had simply been born fortunate. And that illusion mattered, because Victorian society prized effortlessness. To try too hard was unseemly. To need cosmetics was suspect. Arsenic erased the signs of effort. No telltale streaks, no obvious residue. Just glow. But that was another layer. Fear. Illness was everywhere in the 19th century. Tuberculosis, cholera, scarlet fever. People watched bodies fail around them daily. To look healthy was to ward off suspicion. A glowing face reassured others, and oneself, that decay had not yet begun. Doctors reinforced these beliefs. They praised good color. They encouraged appetite. They associated pallor with disease. When arsenic produced visible results, it appeared to confirm medical wisdom. Even when patients felt worse, they looked better. And so beauty became a form of denial, a shield against uncertainty, a way to claim control in a world where death was common and unpredictable. Arsenic was not just cosmetic, it was psychological. This chapter of the story is not about vanity, it is about pressure, about a society that demanded perfection without offering safety, about individuals making rational choices inside an irrational system. When arsenic entered the dressing room, it did not feel like danger, it felt like hope. And once hope takes root, it is very difficult to pull it out, especially when it works. In the next chapter, we'll see how medicine, still uncertain, still experimental, gave arsenic its stamp of approval, and how science, half understood, turned a poison into a prescription. Chapter 2: The Science They Thought They Understood. To understand how arsenic entered Victorian bodies so easily, we have to step into the Victorian mind. Not the caricature of superstition we imagine today, but a world standing awkwardly between old beliefs and new science. The 19th century was not ignorant, it was confident, and that confidence would prove dangerous. Victorian medicine was a house under renovation. Some rooms were modern, others still leaned on ancient foundations. Doctors no longer believed illness came from curses or demons, but they also didn't yet understand bacteria, toxins, or cellular damage. What they had instead was theory, and theory, when incomplete, can be deadly. For centuries, Western medicine had relied on humoral theory. The body was believed to be governed by 4 humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Health meant balance. Illness meant excess or deficiency. Though humoral language was fading by the Victorian era, its logic still lingered. Doctors continued to think in terms of stimulation, suppression, strengthening, purging. Arsenic fit neatly into this framework. Arsenic was classified as a stimulant. In small doses, it appeared to increase appetite, improve circulation, warm the body, brighten the complexion. Patients reported feeling more energetic. Their cheeks flushed, their eyes sparkled. To a Victorian physician, this was evidence of success. They were watching the body react to poison and calling it vitality. Dosage mattered, or so they believed. The concept that the dose makes the poison was well known. Arsenic, like mercury and opium, was dangerous in excess, but acceptable in controlled amounts. This belief allowed doctors to walk a narrow line between cure and harm, without realizing how thin that line truly was. The problem was not that doctors were careless. The problem was that their tools for observation were limited. They could see skin color, appetite, demeanor. They could not see liver damage, nerve degeneration, cellular toxicity. When arsenic worked cosmetically, it masked its own damage. Victorian physicians relied heavily on visible improvement. If a patient looked better, the treatment was considered effective. If symptoms worsened, the assumption was the dose was wrong, the illness was stubborn, the patient was weak. Rarely was the medicine blamed. Medical journals of the time praised arsenic openly. It was described as restorative, fortifying, invigorating. Doctors shared case studies where arsenic appeared to relieve chronic illness. What they didn't document, or didn't connect, were the slow, cumulative effects. Because arsenic rarely killed quickly, it eroded, and erosion is easy to misinterpret. Take anemia. A pale, fatigued patient given arsenic might develop flushed cheeks and appetite. On paper, success, but beneath the surface, arsenic interfered with red blood cells and organs. The visible improvement delayed recognition of the damage. This pattern repeated again and again. Arsenic was also favored because it was predictable. Unlike herbal remedies, which varied in strength, arsenic was chemically consistent. Doctors liked certainty, even when that certainty was misplaced. Then there was professional pressure. Victorian doctors operated in a competitive environment. Patients expected results. Reputation mattered. New treatments were signs of progress. Arsenic represented modernity, a chemical solution for a chemical body. To reject it risked appearing outdated. Medical authority was expanding, but not yet regulated. Doctors disagreed openly. Standards varied wildly. One physician's miracle cure was another's questionable experiment. Arsenic thrived in that uncertainty. And then there was Fowler's solution. Introduced in the late 18th century, this arsenic-based tonic became a staple of Victorian medicine. It was prescribed for skin diseases, asthma, tuberculosis, menstrual disorders, nervous conditions. Doctors trusted it because it had a name, a formula, and a pedigree. Patients trusted it because doctors did. Authority is powerful, especially wrapped in science. What no one fully understood was accumulation. Arsenic did not simply pass through the body, it lingered. It embedded itself in skin, hair, nails, organs. Small doses, taken daily, built silently. But Victorian science lacked the tools to detect that buildup. When patients developed symptoms, nausea, weakness, tingling limbs, hair loss, doctors interpreted them through existing frameworks. Female hysteria, general debility, nervous exhaustion. The poison was invisible, the diagnosis was convenient. Even death certificates rarely mentioned arsenic unless poisoning was obvious and intentional. Chronic exposure slipped through the cracks. One death meant little. Patterns were hard to see in a world already saturated with illness. Victorian science was advancing rapidly. Chemistry was blossoming, laboratories were emerging, but progress was uneven. The ability to create substances outpaced the ability to understand them. Arsenic was ahead of its consequences. This chapter of the story is not about stupidity. It is about transition, a moment when confidence outran comprehension, when trust in science became faith, and faith went unquestioned. Because arsenic did not announce itself as danger, it arrived wearing the language of progress, of medicine, of modernity. And once medicine had approved arsenic, it was only a matter of time before commerce took it further. In the next chapter, we'll watch arsenic leave the doctor's office and enter the marketplace, where beauty, profit, and poison collided, without restraint. Chapter 3. The Arsenic Eaters of Styria. Long before arsenic became fashionable, before it was bottled, branded, and advertised, it was eaten quietly. High in the eastern Alps, in a region known as Styria, a peculiar tradition took root, one that would later mesmerize doctors, journalists, and social reformers across Europe. Here, arsenic was not beauty, it was endurance. Styria was rugged, steep slopes, thin air, long winters. Life here demanded strength. Peasants walked miles across mountainous terrain daily. They labored in harsh conditions with little medical care. Breathing itself was work, and in this landscape, arsenic appeared not as a luxury, but as a tool. Styrian peasants consumed arsenic in tiny quantities, often scraped from naturally occurring mineral deposits. The doses were minuscule, sometimes no larger than a grain of rice. They believed arsenic improved lung capacity, increased physical stamina, strengthened the heart, enhanced resistance to illness, and to outside observers, it seemed to work. Arsenic eaters were described as robust, rosy-cheeked, strong-limbed, capable of extraordinary exertion. They climbed steep mountain paths without gasping. They endured cold with remarkable tolerance, and this terrified and fascinated physicians in equal measure. By the early 19th century, reports of the Styrian arsenic eaters circulated through Europe. Doctors traveled to observe them, journalists documented their habits, medical journals debated their existence. Some doubted the accounts entirely. Others saw proof that arsenic, carefully controlled, could be beneficial. The truth, as always, was far more complicated. What fascinated observers most was tolerance. Arsenic eaters could consume doses that would kill an unaccustomed person. But tolerance did not come quickly. It was built over years. Arsenic consumption began in adolescence. Doses increased gradually, and, most crucially, stopping suddenly could be fatal. This detail was often mentioned and almost always ignored. When arsenic eaters stopped, they experienced severe nausea, vomiting, diarrhea, heart palpitations, breathing difficulty, in some cases, death. The body, adapted to constant low-level poisoning, could no longer function without it. This was not resilience, it was dependence. But Victorian observers focused on the glow, they focused on the strength, they focused on what could be seen. They failed to ask why a health practice required lifelong maintenance and punished those who stopped. There is a critical distinction here. Styrian arsenic eating was not a casual habit. It was embedded in culture, environment, and generational knowledge. Doses were carefully judged by experience, not precision instruments. The practice was limited, localized, and deeply contextual. Victorian society extracted only the headline, "People eat arsenic and thrive." They ignored everything else. Then doctors returned from Styria. They carried stories, but not safeguards. They reported benefits without fully explaining risk. They described tolerance without emphasizing time. They framed arsenic as manageable without explaining its trap. In Victorian England and Europe, these accounts took on a life of their own. Arsenic eating became a medical curiosity, a justification, a selling point. If peasants could do it, surely refined society could do it better. This assumption would cost lives. Urban arsenic use had none of the Styrian constraints, no gradual acclimation, no inherited knowledge, no cultural understanding of withdrawal. People began taking arsenic for beauty, fashion, social advantage, often daily, often unsupervised, and often with no plan for stopping. Victorian doctors debated the arsenic eaters endlessly. Some used them as evidence of arsenic's safety. Others warned that imitation was dangerous. But debate rarely slowed enthusiasm. The narrative had already escaped. There is something deeply human here. When we see proof that something dangerous can be survived, we convince ourselves that survival is guaranteed. We mistake exception for rule. The Styrian arsenic eaters were not proof that arsenic was safe. They were proof that the human body can adapt, sometimes disastrously. Adaptation is not immunity. By mid-century, arsenic had crossed a threshold, no longer a curiosity, no longer a rural oddity. It was becoming normalized. Medical authority had noticed it, society had absorbed it, commerce was ready to exploit it. In the next chapter, we'll watch arsenic step fully into the public eye, packaged, promoted, and promised as beauty in a bottle. Once arsenic entered the marketplace, it would no longer be guided by tradition, only demand. Chapter 4. Arsenic enters the marketplace. Once arsenic left the doctor's hand, it did not wander, it multiplied. By the mid-19th century, Europe, and especially Britain, was transforming. Industrialization accelerated, cities expanded, literacy increased. And with literacy came something new and powerful: advertising. For the first time, products could speak directly to the public. They could promise, they could persuade, they could normalize. Arsenic arrived at exactly the right moment. There were no regulations requiring proof of safety, no standardized testing. A manufacturer needed only two things: an appealing claim and a believable authority. Arsenic had both. Medical journals had already praised it, doctors prescribed it openly, scientific language surrounded it. That legitimacy flowed effortlessly into commerce. What had once been a prescription became a product. Arsenic was marketed carefully, not as poison, not as danger, but as restoration. Complexion wafers, bloom pills, rejuvenating tonics. The names mattered. They framed arsenic not as intervention, but as enhancement, something you added to become what you were meant to be. Not new, not artificial, just improved. Advertisements filled newspapers, women's magazines, and pamphlets. They used the language of refinement, words like delicate, transparent, pure, natural. Poison was hidden behind poetry. One advertisement promised a whiteness the envy of society, achieved without paint or powder. Another assured perfect safety when taken as directed. There was always a condition, when taken as directed. But what were the directions? Often vague, sometimes contradictory, occasionally terrifying. Some products advised increasing doses slowly, others warned never to stop suddenly. Few explained why, and fewer still explained what happened if you ignored the advice. Consumers were trusted to manage poison themselves. Arsenic products were priced strategically, affordable enough for the middle class, aspirational enough for the working class. Beauty was becoming democratized, and arsenic was one of its tools. This mattered because for working women, shopgirls, seamstresses, factory workers, appearance could mean survival. A pleasant face could mean better employment. A refined look could mean protection from judgment. Arsenic promised an edge, and edges are tempting. Manufacturers leaned heavily on testimonials, stories of women transformed. Before and after descriptions filled columns. Once pale and frail, now glowing with vitality. Once overlooked, now admired. The body became a marketing surface. There was no long-term follow-up, no mention of what happened years later. Only immediate results mattered. Men were not excluded. Some arsenic tonics targeted male consumers to increase vigor, to sharpen the mind, to restore confidence. Beauty and strength blurred together. Poison became performance enhancement. And then there was packaging. Small bottles, elegant labels, Latin phrases for credibility. Products looked medical, scientific, safe. This visual language mattered. It reassured buyers that arsenic belonged in their homes, on their dressing tables, beside their mirrors. Retailers played their part. Pharmacists sold arsenic-based products without hesitation. Some offered advice, others simply rang up the sale. There was no unified standard. Responsibility diffused into anonymity. When harm occurred, blame was unclear. Was it the manufacturer, the doctor, the consumer? Often it was no one. As demand grew, quality declined. Not all arsenic products were equal. Some were overdosed, others contaminated, still others mislabeled. Consumers had no way to know. Counterfeit products emerged. Unregulated mixtures promised even stronger effects. The market rewarded intensity. Subtlety disappeared. Poison thrives in competition. By the late 19th century, arsenic was no longer remarkable. It was routine, a normal part of beauty culture, something women discussed casually, something men recommended quietly, something doctors tolerated. This is the most dangerous phase of any harmful practice, when it stops feeling risky, when it becomes habit, when questioning it feels unnecessary or impolite. Arsenic didn't spread through ignorance, it spread through familiarity, through repetition, through trust. And all the while the bodies consuming it were changing. Damage accumulated invisibly. Skin thinned, Organs strained, nerves degraded, but mirrors still reflected beauty, for a while. In the next chapter, we'll follow arsenic deeper, into the medicine cabinet, into the doctor's prescription pad, into a single solution trusted by thousands, Fowler's solution, where poison and professionalism finally became indistinguishable. Chapter 5. Fowler's Solution, Medicine or Misery. If arsenic had remained a beauty secret, it might have faded quietly. But it did not. It was given a name, a formula, a pedigree, and once that happened, it became respectable. Fowler's solution was introduced in 1786 by Dr. Thomas Fowler, a respected English physician. It was simple in composition: potassium arsenite, dissolved in distilled water, stabilized with alcohol, measured carefully, prescribed confidently. By the Victorian era, Fowler's solution was everywhere. Doctors trusted it, not because it was harmless, but because it was familiar. Fowler's solution had been in use for decades. Longevity in medicine often masquerades as proof. The solution was prescribed for an astonishing range of conditions: psoriasis and eczema, asthma and bronchitis, anemia, tuberculosis, rheumatism, epilepsy, menstrual irregularities, nervous disorders, general weakness. If a disease involved fatigue, pallor, or decline, arsenic was considered appropriate. It was medicine's answer to uncertainty. The logic seemed sound, at least at first. Arsenic stimulated appetite. It increased blood flow to the skin. Patients often reported feeling stronger. Doctors observed improvement and recorded success. What they did not see was what arsenic was doing internally. Arsenic interferes with cellular respiration. It disrupts enzymes essential to energy production. In short, it starves cells of oxygen while giving the illusion of vitality. Victorian medicine did not yet understand this. So when patients developed side effects, those effects were interpreted through existing medical frameworks. Nausea became digestive weakness, hair loss became stress, numbness became nervous temperament. The medicine was rarely questioned. Fowler's solution was often prescribed long-term. Patients took it for months, sometimes years. Doses were adjusted by observation, not testing. If a patient worsened, the dose was often increased. Poison became persistence. Medical textbooks of the time praised Fowler's solution cautiously but favorably. Warnings existed, but they were couched in vague language. Use judiciously. Monitor the patient. Discontinue if severe symptoms arise. What constituted severe was subjective, and symptoms often emerged slowly. There is a dangerous assumption here that harm announces itself clearly, that the body will protest loudly before failing. Arsenic does not work that way. Patients trusted doctors. Doctors trusted tradition. Tradition trusted arsenic. Responsibility became circular. Women were disproportionately prescribed Fowler's solution. It was recommended for menstrual pain, irregular cycles, infertility, female weakness, emotional distress. Symptoms now understood as endocrine, psychological, or neurological were treated with arsenic, silently, persistently. The solution promised control over bodies that frightened Victorian medicine. Doctors recorded successes. They rarely recorded failures. Deaths attributed to arsenic were often classified as consumption, heart failure, nervous collapse. Chronic poisoning rarely appeared on certificates. There was no incentive to connect the dots. And then there was dosage. Fowler's solution required careful measurement, but precision instruments were not standardized. Droppers varied, instructions differed, human error was constant. One extra drop could matter, especially when taken daily. Some physicians noticed patterns. They observed skin discoloration, digestive distress, gradual decline. A few raised concerns, but medicine, like society, resists admitting harm, especially when the harm is systemic. To abandon Fowler's solution would have meant admitting decades of error, that doctors had harmed patients they intended to heal, that science had outrun understanding. This was not an easy truth to accept. So the solution persisted. It moved from hospitals to households. Patients self-administered, families passed bottles down. Arsenic became familiar, comforting. By the late Victorian period, Fowler's solution was slowly falling out of favor, not because it was conclusively disproven, but because chemistry advanced, new treatments emerged, and arsenic's reputation began to crack. But for many, the damage was already done. Bodies weakened quietly, lives shortened subtly, beauty preserved until it wasn't. In the next chapter, we'll leave the bottle behind and look at arsenic when no one expected it, in walls, in fabric, in homes. Because for Victorians, arsenic was not just swallowed, it was breathed. Chapter 6. Arsenic in the walls. By the time arsenic reached the walls, it was no longer a secret. It was no longer a choice. It was simply there. Victorian homes were meant to be sanctuaries, places of respectability, of safety, of moral order. But behind the lace curtains and polished wood, danger clung to the walls themselves. Bright, beautiful, deadly. Green was the color of fashion, not a muted green, but vivid, emerald, apple, viridian. It signaled modern taste, prosperity, and refinement, and it was everywhere. Wallpaper manufacturers competed fiercely. The brighter the pigment, the better it sold. Two compounds dominated the market: Shields green, Paris green. Both relied heavily on arsenic, a great deal of it. These wallpapers adorned parlors, dining rooms, nurseries, bedrooms. They framed family portraits, they surrounded cradles, they lined spaces meant for rest and safety. No warning labels, no disclaimers, just color. At first, concerns were cosmetic. The wallpaper stained furniture, it faded unevenly, it reacted poorly to damp air. No one thought of poison. Then came the illnesses. Families began reporting chronic headaches, nausea, fatigue, coughing, skin irritation. Children fell sick most often, infants failed to thrive, toddlers grew weak. Doctors blamed poor ventilation. They weren't wrong, just incomplete. In damp conditions, mold fed on the arsenic pigments. This created arsine gas, colorless, odorless, deadly. It seeped silently into rooms. There was no taste, no smell, no warning, just breath. Every inhale carried risk. Victorian families noticed patterns. Illness worsened at home, improved when traveling, returned upon coming back. Some suspected the walls, most did not. The idea was too strange. After all, wallpaper was decoration. Decoration was harmless. Doctors dismissed early warnings. The symptoms were vague, non-specific, easily attributed to bad air or weak constitution. Arsenic poisoning did not yet have a clear signature. When deaths occurred, they were attributed to consumption, fever, digestive disorders. The walls remained innocent. And then there were the workers, wallpaper printers, pigment mixers, factory hands, many of them women and children. They handled arsenic daily. Powder clung to clothes, settled in hair, entered lungs. Entire communities sickened. Quietly. These were not isolated incidents. They were systemic, but industry resisted scrutiny. Green wallpaper was profitable, and profit dulls caution. Some chemists raised alarms. They published papers. They demonstrated arsenic release. But manufacturers counted. The dose was too small, the danger exaggerated, the complaints hysterical. The debate stalled. Meanwhile, people kept breathing. Parents noticed children licking walls. Yes, licking. Bright green pigment flaked easily. Curiosity turned deadly. Nurseries, meant for safety, became exposure chambers. In some homes, entire families fell ill. In others, only one child. The randomness made it harder to identify the cause. Arsenic did not strike evenly. This unevenness was its camouflage. By mid-century, public concern grew. Newspapers ran stories. Some families stripped wallpaper entirely. Others refused to believe the danger. Green was too beautiful, too fashionable, too entrenched. Admitting the walls were poisonous meant admitting the home was unsafe, and that was unthinkable. Eventually, chemical testing improved. Arsenic could be identified conclusively. Evidence mounted. Regulation followed, slowly. Manufacturers resisted, consumers hesitated. But the color faded, literally. Green wallpaper fell out of fashion, not overnight, but steadily, a silent retreat. Yet arsenic did not disappear. It lingered in old homes, in fabric, in dust. Its presence outlived its popularity. This chapter matters because it removes intent. No one chose to eat wallpaper. No one swallowed poison knowingly. Arsenic became environmental, unavoidable. It blurred the line between beauty and harm completely. In the next chapter, we'll follow the consequences, the slow collapse of bodies exposed to arsenic over years, the symptoms that puzzled doctors, the damage no mirror could hide forever. Because once arsenic entered the walls, there was no escape. Chapter 7: The Long Decline. By the late 19th century, arsenic had infiltrated Victorian life completely. It was swallowed in tonics. It was licked from wallpaper. It was inhaled from fabrics, paints, and household dust. For some, the effects were immediate. For most, the poison worked slowly, a little at a time, day after day, decade after decade. The first signs were subtle: a flush in the cheeks, shivering hands, tingling in the fingers and toes, fatigue that no sleep could cure. Victorians called it weakness. Doctors diagnosed it as nervous exhaustion. Families dismissed it as overwork. Few realized that arsenic was reshaping the body from the inside. Nerves degenerated, muscles atrophied, organs weakened silently. Victorians interpreted the symptoms through their own lens: female hysteria, melancholia, delicate constitution. The language of morality masked the language of toxicity. As the years passed, the damage accumulated. Some developed persistent digestive issues, nausea, vomiting, stomach cramps. Others experienced neurological symptoms, numbness, tremors, unsteady gait. The body was quietly betraying itself. Children were especially vulnerable. Those exposed to arsenic from wallpaper or clothing often showed developmental delays. They fell ill repeatedly. Some never reached adulthood. It was a generational tragedy hidden in plain sight. Despite this, appearances could remain deceptively normal. Cheeks could glow, eyes could sparkle. The outward signs of vitality often masked the inner decline, which meant arsenic was doubly dangerous. It could make someone look healthy while slowly destroying them. Doctors, constrained by the medical knowledge of the time, often misdiagnosed chronic arsenic poisoning as anemia, tuberculosis, chronic fatigue, stomach ulcers. In the absence of clear evidence, the poison went unnoticed. And when deaths occurred, they were rarely linked to arsenic. It was invisible, silent, patient. Fowler's solution continued to be prescribed for decades, daily doses built over months and years. Even those who survived the acute effects suffered from long-term consequences: thinning hair, brittle nails, skin lesions, kidney damage. Some endured permanent nerve damage, others succumbed to organ failure years later. The body became a record of repeated exposure, but the mirror never lied. The glow of youth and vitality remained, at least on the surface, masking the slow decay underneath. Socially, the effects were devastating. Women relied on beauty for survival. Arsenic offered it, but it also exacted a price. Some became dependent. Some became ill and unable to work. Some died quietly, their deaths written off as unfortunate circumstances. In families, suspicion sometimes arose. Why was one child sick while another seemed fine? Why did one relative linger in illness while the next thrived? The randomness of chronic poisoning confounded doctors, terrified families, and silenced inquiry. Even as chemistry advanced, the slow decline continued. Early warnings were piecemeal. Public awareness lagged behind reality. Poison lurked in homes, tonics, and fabrics. Victorians were trapped between beauty and destruction, trusting in appearances while their bodies betrayed them. Arsenic exposed a truth about Victorian society. Appearance mattered more than health. Authority mattered more than evidence. Trust mattered more than safety. And when these values were combined with a poison that hid its damage, tragedy became inevitable. The long decline was not dramatic. There were no explosions, no sudden catastrophes. It was incremental, creeping, silent, a slow surrender of vitality to the very substance celebrated as a cure. In the next chapter, we'll explore the public reckoning, how authorities began to recognize arsenic's dangers, how newspapers, scientists, and reformers slowly exposed the truth, and how the poison that promised beauty and health became a cautionary tale for generations. Because every long decline eventually meets a reckoning. Chapter 8: Regulation, Resistance, and Denial. By the late 19th century, the evidence could no longer be ignored. Bodies weakened, children fell ill, doctors began connecting dots. Arsenic was no longer just a medicine, a cosmetic, or a wallpaper pigment. It was a public health crisis. But recognition did not come quickly. Victorians were slow to admit what had been happening in plain sight for decades. After all, arsenic was entwined with everyday life, in homes, on dressing tables, in classrooms, even in factories. Admitting the danger meant admitting complicity. And humans resist acknowledging complicity. Early efforts at regulation began in Britain in the 1860s and 1870s. Authorities proposed labeling requirements for arsenic-containing products, restrictions on arsenic in food and drink, guidance for doctors prescribing Fowler's solution. But enforcement was weak, penalties were minimal, and manufacturers resisted vigorously. Some argued that warning labels would frighten the public unnecessarily. Others claimed arsenic was essential for health in moderation. The logic echoed that of previous decades. Trust the authority, trust the formula, trust the results. Resistance was not just industrial, it was social. Many families, especially the middle and upper classes, refused to believe that beauty products or wallpaper could harm them. Some dismissed warnings as alarmism. Others clung to arsenic products for the same reason they had embraced them in the first place: appearance, social standing, and the illusion of health. Newspapers carried reports of arsenic deaths, but the coverage was uneven. Some sensationalized it, others downplayed it. The result: confusion, denial, and selective awareness. The irony is striking. Victorian society prided itself on rationality and science, yet it refused to apply those tools to a poison that had infiltrated daily life. Meanwhile, reformers and public health advocates continued to push. They published articles on arsenic and wallpaper, case studies of poisonings in children, medical observations of chronic Fowler's solution users. Chemical analysis confirmed arsenic in homes, schools, and workplaces. But knowledge alone was not enough. Commerce, fashion, and trust in authority proved stronger than warnings. In some cities, local governments tried bans. In Paris, authorities restricted arsenic pigments in wallpaper. In London, certain tonics were removed from pharmacy shelves. Yet enforcement was inconsistent. Arsenic remained accessible to those who sought it. Doctors continued prescribing it cautiously, and some believed it safe when used properly. But who defined proper? Dosage varied wildly, preparation differed between pharmacists, patient adherence was inconsistent. Every loophole preserved opportunity for harm. Resistance was also psychological. Victorians had invested decades of trust in arsenic. To admit it was harmful would undermine faith in medicine, the social emphasis on beauty, personal decisions regarding health. Denial became a coping mechanism. The language of denial was subtle. These are isolated cases. Improper use caused these incidents. Moderation prevents danger. In short, arsenic itself was never to blame. Yet change came gradually. Scientific advances, better chemistry, toxicology, and epidemiology finally made arsenic's cumulative effects undeniable. Regulations strengthened in the early 20th century. Wallpaper pigments changed, Fowler's solution fell out of favor, and society began to reckon with the long-term damage. But the resistance, the denial, the slow acceptance, it cost lives. Generations had been exposed, often unknowingly. The invisible poison had lingered in homes, medicine cabinets, and minds. This chapter is a reminder that knowledge alone does not prevent harm. Authority, habit, beauty, and trust can all delay action, even when the danger is obvious. In the next and final chapter, we'll examine the legacy of the arsenic craze, how it shaped Victorian medicine, consumer culture, and public health policy, and how it remains a cautionary tale, a story of beauty, science, and the human cost of misplaced trust. The modern echo. The Victorians were obsessed with beauty. They sought it in powders, tonics, and the gleam of a perfectly painted wall. They trusted authority, tradition, and fashion. And for decades, they paid a hidden price. Arsenic may seem like a relic, a story of a past age, but the lessons are surprisingly modern. We still chase quick fixes. We still trust authority without question. We still pursue beauty, performance, and social approval, sometimes at the cost of our own health. The difference is that we have science, regulation, and history to guide us, if we pay attention. The legacy of the arsenic craze survives in ways we often forget, in the cautious approach to new medications, in regulations that protect consumers from hazardous chemicals, in our fascination with miracle cures that promise transformation. Every time a new supplement is marketed as a shortcut to health or beauty, we are reminded of those Victorian faces, rosy-cheeked, confident, and unaware of the poison within. We can imagine them, a young woman in a brightly lit parlor, admiring the green walls that made her nursery beautiful, while the very air she breathes carries hidden danger. A patient taking Fowler's solution faithfully, watching as vitality seems to return, even as the slow decline continues unnoticed. A society that believed it could control nature, only to discover that poison does not ask permission. History whispers its warnings. It reminds us that trust must be earned, not assumed, that beauty should never be worth harm, that the quiet, invisible dangers of convenience and fashion can accumulate over years before anyone realizes the cost. And yet, there is hope. We learn from the mistakes of the past. We regulate, we question, we measure. Science corrects itself, society adapts, but only if we remember. So, next time you see a product promising instant beauty, miraculous health, or quick performance, pause, ask questions, read the labels, and think of the Victorians and the green walls and the bottles of Fowler's solution, because history, as always, is watching. And if you're wondering, no, I don't recommend you try a Victorian beauty regimen at home, unless you want your morning skincare routine to double as a chemistry experiment. And remember, some secrets are beautiful, and some are deadly. Choose wisely. Well, dear listeners, that concludes our grim little journey into Victorian beauty and their love affair with poison. Remember, those rosy cheeks weren't always a sign of health. They might have been a warning label in disguise. So, the next time you reach for a beauty product promising eternal youth, flawless skin, or miraculous results, pause. Ask yourself, is this making me beautiful or slowly reshaping my organs? Because let's be honest, if the Victorians taught us anything, it's that vanity can be a real killer. And if you're still tempted to try a Victorian arsenic mask at home, don't. You might end up looking perfect and permanently regretting it. So polish your mirrors, keep your powders in the cabinet, and maybe avoid that bottle of miracle tonic from Aunt Agatha. Thank you for joining the Story Vault, Buried Truths. Like, subscribe, and keep coming back for more tales that are equal parts fascinating, horrifying, and occasionally deadly. After all, history has a wicked sense of humor, and so do we.